He's up to 71 itself. I don't touch on the wall, but what I also do is I look at their leadership of these constituencies, and that's provided through, I look at sort of Maulana through these constituencies through Maulana Bhashani himself, and I started that during my MPhil and continued that for my PhDs. There are things that Ahmadullah was saying that was striking me, and I feel like I should respond to them first before I move on to my own talk, which is, that the idea that most historians, or we don't value the work written by sort of other sort of Bangladeshi historians. I don't think that's entirely correct. I think there's been some brilliant pieces of work written by Bangladeshi historians and in Bengali, and I think that's possibly due to the fact that we don't know it is due to our own accessibility to the language or to the vernacular itself, but also in the sense that the reason why we don't have access, or the sort of work, the history work that we should be doing isn't being done, is really a question of power as well. It's a power in terms of who makes the sort of makes the sources, who makes the archives, who makes the narratives, who makes history. So what I was doing yesterday was really just trying to Google famous historians, and if you look at the sort of the title, I think what you'll have is Ibn Khaldun is there, but you have H. Carr, Xenophon, Thucydides, really white old men making, and I have no objections to white old men making histories, but it gives you a sense of who's writing. Who we consider, what we consider as history and what we consider to be historians. If we move to the next. And this is another image that I sourced. Well, it's also something that I'm doing a review of, and it's of a recent series on Radio 4, which was done by Sunil Kilnani, which was looking at sort of 50 lives of 50 Indian lives, but the Indian lives was brought, it was really looking at subcontinental figures. If you look at the map, you'll see that it's not very clear, but for Bengal you only have Tagore, Roy, Vivekananda, and then East Bengal is entirely missing. There's clearly no person coming out of East Bengal that is of any sort of importance or has a geographical or an intellectual or cultural reach beyond East Bengal. And then there's, or so the story goes. And then there's Sindh and Balochistan on the other area that's missing, and then there's large areas of India that's missing. And I think that says something about the sort of, the actors and sites of the production of history. It's not neutral. Yeah, they impact on the histories we write and those who are served by such histories. Histories are filled with silences and denials, and my work as a historian has been to lean in more closely, to listen to those silences more carefully, and to provide a more truer picture of how change happens and the failures and possibilities of the world we inhabit. So the task of a historian is thus, for me, let me get it up here so that I can tell you. So the task of a historian really is, if I'm going to be quite pompous, it's really to, and quoting Nietzsche, who also cites Goethe, and he says, "I hate everything that merely instructs me without increasing or directly quickening any activity." The act of history is a political one. It's to give you, it's one of a sense of responsibility. It's to do something with it. It's a political act. It's to use that knowledge and to do something with it. And inspired by sort of E.P. Thompson and sort of early English Marxists and the earlier work of Subaltern Studies, my work seeks to restore subaltern figures and their leaders into sort of in the sort of writings of history. Just to give you a sense of who those are. Yeah, please, could we play that clip? So this is, on your left is Burhan Chacha, who I met, who's an 80-year-old murid of Bhashani, who is actually not 80, I'm reducing him I'm making him a lot younger than he is. He's 96, he was 94 years old. When I met him, he called himself an Adorsho Krishok, he, yeah, you can. I'll translate. So these are people that don't get written into histories, but have a fairly important role in sort of understanding, or at least thinking about the political imagination, or even the social imagination around sort of nation states, around leaders, around authority, around equality. So for those who didn't understand the Bengali, this is really him talking about why he was attracted to Maulana Bhashani in a very thick Tangail accent. He's telling you the reason why he was attracted to Bhashani was because Maulana Bhashani was one of the very few people that had asked or called or prayed for world peace, or the peace for, and you know, for that was it for him. He became the Mahabidrohi, the one, the major rebel, and everything. And it's really, my work has been to restore these figures in the history, and as well as their leaders, from who are really sort of part of this part of an archive which condescends on them. I mean, he not only writes them out of histories, but also condescends upon them. They are the rustic, they are the illiterate figures of our histories. And really what Bhashani and Burhan do is also gives us an idea of not really of just the histories of Bengal, but also the subcontinent, and if not, the wider geographies of Bengal. And there are a number of reasons why I do what I do, which is look at East Bengal and look at Bhashani and Burhan and figures like Burhan Chacha, as well as other figures, other subaltern figures. And that's largely because Bengal, similar to colonial tropes, appears on the periphery of the historian's imagination. Willem van Schendel writes, first, to most people, this is one of the world's most marginal. He's writing about the borderlands, but I'm extending it to Bangladesh. And he writes, first, to most people, this is one of the world's most marginal places, the periphery of the periphery. Located in a poor, powerless, and largely ignored part of the world, it forms the perimeters of societies that are themselves seen as little consequence in world affairs. As a result, it has hardly been studied. Ignorance may not breed contempt, but it certainly breeds prejudice. And you see that prejudice amongst historians. If you look at historians and what they want to study the bigger nation states. You know, they want to study the bigger partition, which is that of 1947, not 1971. They want to study, I mean, and it's sort of following a similar, if you look at sort of colonial records of how East Bengal is talked about. It really is one of, you know, these, I mean, it really is a sense of that this East Bengal is it's not a savage place, but it's, you know, it's a backwater, it's the backyards of the hinterland of Calcutta. It's Calcutta that needs to be studied. It's not sort of East Bengal as such. And this is what's happened to the larger sort of study of history writing for East Bengal. It's been the study of Bengal has been overlooked by both historians and social scientists alike, who've preferred to work on India and Pakistan itself. Partition studies maintains this obsessive gaze on the partition of August 1947 as an unparalleled event. And Punjab as the primary site of violence, population dislocation and movement, and the organized politics of Muslim League and Congress as the impotence behind mass political mobilization. There is no need to study other partitions beyond that of Punjab or beyond that of 1947. There is no need to study the idea of beyond partition, there's a story of decoloniality. There's a story of independence. There is a story of, which isn't looked at. Because that idea of partition or that idea of violence is not the same as it is in Bengal as it is for Punjab. There's a bigger story there of how people understood or how Pakistan was understood. The other reasons why Bengal or sort of Bangladesh has been overlooked is really the privileging of colonial history by historians of South Asia and the historians' obsession with the originary moment, which has further reinforced this moment. So much so that the third quarter of the 20th century has been perhaps the least studied in the modern history of South Asia. The publications of the last decade or so have reflected the state of affairs, with only 2 significant pieces of work on life in East Pakistan, whereas the last year has seen over 7 publications on 47 and just 71 itself. There's an interest in beginnings and ends, but not life that was lived in between. And Ahmed Kamal, in his excellent and path-breaking work, State Against Nation, acknowledges the staleness in the historiography of East Pakistan. He says, all histories of Bangladesh are written as if we knew everything that there was to be about what went wrong with East Pakistan. As a result, the history of this background has taken on a certain predictable quality. It is no longer a dynamic field of investigation where new mines of information are quarried every day and the findings passionately disputed, or where the contours change continually as new layers of history expose themselves to the historian's gaze. So, the other reason why I do the history of Bengal, or why I'm sort of looking at the history of Bengal, is because so far most of the narratives around it has been the narrative of the nationalist, or sort of the narrative of the nation state. And the history of the nation state has been posited as a history of the people, although the ideological imperatives for writing both are very different. A history of the people is not necessarily split from the narrative of the nation, but one suggests that though people and groups and communities were connected to each other through their participation in similar events, this did not translate into a common experience. There are different ontologies, epistemes, and registers for interpreting various events. How a peasant in sort of North Bengal saw the events of 1969 is different from how students were registering those events in Dhaka itself. And this is where the history that has written so far hasn't taken that into account. It has written it as a homogeneous sort of national sort of narrative. Now, Howard Zinn, in his work, A People's History of the United States, argues that nations are not communities and never have been. The history of any country presented as the history of a family conceals fierce conflicts of interest, sometimes between conquerors and conquered, masters and slaves, capitalists and workers, dominators and dominated in race and sex. In writing this national narrative, what has happened is that certain events receive an inordinate attention at the expense of other narratives. The Bhasha Andolan has been described in most historiographies as a defining moment, that clarion call in the Bengali struggle for independence. It represents the moment when East Pakistan becomes a problem province. However, were events surrounding the 1952 language movement to be explored more openly, this would reveal a number of interesting and important tensions complicating and rupturing that narrative, such as Bhashani's rallying support for the language protest on the 21st of February amongst madrasas in North Bengal over this period, whilst also calling for the establishment of a kingdom of God. The infighting within the all-party state language committee between the communist-oriented Democratic Youth League and members of the Awami League, or even Sir Thomas Ellis's language inquiry report into the firing on the 21st of February, which mentioned that the majority of statements that he received from the public came from bus bus conductors, drivers, and rickshaw-wallahs, complaining about the lawlessness of the student body and the damage done to their vehicles. Now, what I don't want to do is I don't want to diminish or undermine the importance of the language movement or the demand for provincial autonomy, but instead to draw out differences that have been erased or subsumed and which point to different meanings and possibilities. And this is where I refer to someone called Lisa Mitchell's work, she works on Telugu nationalism. And she makes an argument about structure of visibility to explain why the death of 4 young men in one of the language protests had only been understood in terms of their commitment to the mother tongue. And she states that events such as funeral processions or any other public occasions can be arranged in such a manner, discursively or otherwise, to solicit, focus and direct people's attention and emotions, so it becomes difficult to think of these events through different lenses. I suggest that histories of Bengali nationalism and 71 have been similarly stage managed in such a manner, leaving little space for interrogation or more ambivalent reading of such events. It also becomes quite important to think that why is it that the language movement has been regarded as the most important story to tell about the emergence of Bangladesh? Or why has this aspect of culture been foregrounded as the primary site of contestation and dispute between East Pakistan and West Pakistanis? The category of culture, so far in our history writing, has been a unified, homogeneous and immutable concept, rather than a category that is sensitive to and identifies ruptures within the notion. And this has meant that the contribution of the subaltern and the narrative of their struggle have got short shrift and risks being forgotten. Pakistan was not an empty idea patched together by some Indian Muslim elites and sold to an impressionable, unsuspecting and inert Muslim public. Hidden from our histories are the stories of the 800,000 muhajirs who travelled from various regions of eastern India, such as Tripura, Assam and West Bengal, into East Pakistan in 1947. There's the story of Khawaz Bepari, the village headman and treacle seller who charged his customers at the rate of 2 pies per mond of treacle to realise subscription. Then there's Mumtaz, who with his friend collected 2 rupees from the Muslim shopkeepers and customers and deposited it in the League Fund. And the story of the Bengali peasant woman who could only conceive of Pakistan in terms of the eternal Eid and the Choto Qiyamat, the minor doomsday. East Pakistan was a space produced and shared by the vernacular elite, the industrialists and the rich peasants, as well as the poor labourers and peasants. The land of eternal Eid that turned into a land of empty promises was theirs too. And it is these material and mental transformations of space that created the possibility for the emergence of Bangladesh. So what did I hope to do with my thesis when I was writing it? Was to offer a more complicated picture of how Bangladesh comes about. And it was to endow these peasants and workers as historical agents in the process of, falling in love and falling out of love with the nation state. And so far that hasn't been a rich or a complex or ambiguous space within which historians have dwelt. Joya Chatterjee, who's a Bengal historian, says that the histories of Bengal Muslims pre-1947 concentrated on the process of Islamicization, and after 1947 it becomes a history of triumphant Bengaliness. That's what the history is. So what I do is I borrow from the work of others who are working in modern China and other places where they're looking at the history of the modern nation state, such as Prasenjit Duara, who looks at modern China, is to say that there was no harmonized monologic voice of the nation. Rather, what existed was a polyphony of voices, contradictory and ambiguous, opposing, affirming, and negotiating their views of the nation. I propose that the same tensions existed in the making and unmaking of Pakistan, though the struggles of peasants and workers converged at times with broader political opposition. This did not and transformed with their participation. Had the peasants and workers not entered into the stories of 1969 or in other mobilizations, the story would have been a different one. Am I good for time?
Yes.
Okay. And But their participation itself does not indicate any uniformity in experience or consciousness. In fact, the contested and ambiguous nature and outcome of these popular movements were reflected in the departures that peasant and workers made during them. I show how peasants and workers mobilized differently to other constituencies, responding to a specific sort of language, politics, and practice, which created a tension between them and other constituencies such as students and urban middle class. This was not a politics steeped in pieties or advocating the return of a mythical past, as often suggested by subaltern historians, but one that heralded Islam as a discourse and a project of progress, modernity, and freedom, where students have been traditionally regarded at the forefront of popular struggles, assuming the more radical and progressive positions, such as during the 1969 movement. What I show in my work is the contrary, arguing that students and urban middle class emerged actually as a conservative and repressive force. They repel the more forceful mobilization that's coming from the rural countryside. Now, Tajul Islam Hashmi's description of peasants in Bengal in pre-partition era as God-fearing and awe-stricken by the ravages of nature, debilitated by tremendous inferiority complex, my thesis shows, as it extends itself in the post-colonial era, it does not hold muster. This thesis employs Maulana Bhashani's relationship with peasants and workers as a mediating device, and to access, in a limited way, the life worlds of these communities. Though subaltern communities have often little choice in how they are represented by histories, and leave little traces of their own subjectivities in official archives, Bhashani's leadership offers us valuable insights because of his long-standing relationship with them and his foregrounding of them as key architects of the past as well as the future. I do not suggest a constant or an untroubled relationship. For using the scattered and partial archives that exist, Bhashani's leadership is shown at times to be sharp and clear, and other times it is blurred and hazy, and sometimes it's silent. But there's also something interesting about Maulana Bhashani, and he presents a very complex and tricky subject to write about for a number of reasons. Khalim Siddiqui described Maulana Bhashani's reaction to Sheikh Mujibur Rahman's radio speech as part of the electoral campaign in 1970. In particular, Mujib's preference for British-style democracy as unprincipled. Bhashani appeared had made one of his trademark insults. Nonetheless, it would have been better if Khalim Siddiqui had printed it. Bhashani has left us very few written traces of his own thoughts and ideas for posterity. There is only one tract, Mausetungerdeshe, that can be in the land of Mao Zedong, that can be attributed to him, based on his 2 months visit to China for independence anniversary celebrations in 1963. This perhaps explains the lack of curiosity or attention that Bhashani has attracted as a historical subject, despite having been such a heavyweight figure in South Asian politics. Not just in Bengal politics, but South Asian politics and beyond. Bhashani's career spanned 3 partitions, 1905, 1947, 1971, during which he was the president of the Assam Provincial Muslim League at the height of the Pakistan movement, and then the founder of 2 of the main opposition parties in a united Pakistan, the Awami League and the National Awami Party. And he also commanded an international presence. Bhashani was attending World Peace Councils. He was going off to China. He was going off to Cuba. He was meeting Al-Fatah representatives. But his life and career has managed to elicit 1 or 2 doctoral dissertations. And that's largely because there's the corpus of written work on him has been small. But the other thing is that the US and the UK archives on East Pakistan do mention him. They're replete with instances of politicians, journalists, and members of the intelligentsia of both wings of Pakistan offering information on Bhashani's illiteracy, ignorance, rusticity, irrationality, on him being crude, vulgar, violent, not really a Maulana, not really a communist. And when there's conversations on assessments of his power. These oft-repeated accusations of Bhashani's illiteracy even led to the US Consulate General in 1958 taking measures to ascertain discreetly whether such reports were actually valid. However, the acknowledgement is also there of Bhashani's magnetic personality and his popularity and power over fanatical and illiterate peasants and workers. The question then becomes as to how to reconstruct the historical figure of Bhashani from official documents, newspapers, and interviews that have built him into an object of scorn, ridicule, or derision, unable to explain or account for his power because there's no real relationship that they have with those who can explain Bhashani's power, the peasants and workers, because they're missing from those archives. So it's really to start thinking about what other archives exist. The other difficulty is in weaving together the different selves of Bhashani, his identity as a peer and a politician. So Burhan Chacha, who I showed you earlier on, was a peer, was a murid of Maulana Bhashani. And how do we weave someone who appears in the dreams of peasants, who appears with political messages? So Maulana Bhashani appeared on the 21st night of Ramadan in 2014 in the dream of Burhan Chacha. And he came with he'd initially come to, he'd initially come to Burhan Chacha whilst he was reading a newspaper. This is Burhan Chacha, who's like this peasant who's only read up to class 5, and apparently he's sitting there reading a newspaper, and Bhashani comes and he tells Bhashani, I'm far too busy, can you come back later? So Bhashani is quite obedient apparently, and he says, okay, fine, I'll come back later. And he comes back in the middle of the night and he tells him, American imperialism in Syria will end very soon. And modern technologies, and said the other thing that I need to tell you is that, modern weaponry is not important anymore. The next thing that needs to happen is a people's movement, and that movement needs to be on electricity and energy. And that visit before he comes to Burhan Chacha happens to be, he's apparently flying over trees with a pack of tigers, and he's flying over trees with a pack of tigers, and that's how he appears at the home of Burhan Chacha. Now, what do we do with this information? Is this not history? Is this the meanderings or the madness of a man, of a 96-year-old man? And I say it's not the madness of a 96-year-old man. I think there's something actually happening here, and there's different there's different makings of Bhashani happening here. There's different life worlds that we're working on here. There's different registers of understanding politics. And what I'm trying to do with Bhashani, and so it's really is to say that so far the literature on Bhashani has been the splitting of these cells. It's been divided into hagiographies and more straightforward political histories. So the only biography of Bhashani has been one that's been is by Sayyid Abul Maqsood, and he doesn't really talk about Bhashani as a peer, but or his relationship with the Murids. But what he does do is he writes his second book, which is quite interesting, and that's where he records the stories of these stories of these dreams and of Bhashani's relationship with his Murids. And I'm saying that it's impossible to separate Bhashani's religious and political self. And my work demonstrates how they're continuously in dialogue with each other and simultaneously translating the world. And this continuous, the dreams of Bhashani and his continuous presence in Burhan's life, demanding an andolan, suggests that the birth of Bangladesh has not resolved all tensions or closed off all the possibilities for more radical political, economic, and cultural change to happen. And it's in pursuit of these alternative, might have been histories that the process of making and unmaking a nation state, which the unmaking and unmaking the nation state constantly throws up, and which then remain untold, silenced, or spoken of in conspiratorial whispers, which is where Bhashani is now these days, in conspiratorial whispers, is in which my thesis has taken shape. And what I wanted to do now really was to take you through an exercise as, I mean, since this is also meant to be a workshop, and this is also meant for us to think about sort of how history writing could work and might work. I wanted you to kind of take you through the journey of my sort of doctoral thesis and how it's taken shape, but also to get you to think possibly, I mean, hopefully this is an interactive process, for you to think about the sort of what research questions we could ask around the sources that I'm going to show you, the sort of the possibilities of the sources, the limitation of the sources, and yeah, and just, you know, so that it gets us thinking about other histories than the ones that have been written so far. So if I can get you to, okay. No, that's the problem with that is that you can't, I mean, I don't, so I'm going to take you through a journey of my thesis. Now, this was a poem that was discovered by me in the Assam Legislative Assembly proceedings. Now, a poem that's come from the 40s. It's in Assam, which has now found circulation in protests against big corporates, big factories. This is Rana. This was one of the sort of posters produced. I don't know if this is a good example to start with, because I'm not entirely sure how everyone's Bangla is. Do we have Bangla reader, Bengali? Yes, okay. Okay, that's possibly not a good one to start with. Let's go to...
You have to read it for us. We can't see the writing.
Okay, I mean, if I read it for you, then I'm going to have to explain it, and it's going to... But, so I'm going to go to the next stage, which is really the coming of... we can go to the next one. I think that's an easier one. So this is coming from the papers of Sir Frederick Chalmers Bourne. And this is the oath that he swore to on the 15th of August, 1947, in East Bengal, in East Pakistan. If you read the oath, it says, I do solemnly affirm in the office of the Governor of East Pakistan, I will be faithful and bear true allegiance to His Majesty King George VI, his heirs and successors, and to the Constitution of Pakistan as by laws established. And that I will do right to all manners of people after the laws and usages of Pakistan without fear of favour. I'm sorry, it's repeated again. Clearly there's a mistake. But is there something coming out of this source that you think? I mean, other questions that are emerging? I mean, this is on the day of independence in East Pakistan. There's someone who's promising allegiance to King George VI, his heirs and successors, but also to the Constitution of Pakistan. And I'm just wondering, I mean, what possible thoughts are going around in your head? What is the source telling you? What questions do you have about it? There's something quite remarkable about this source, I think.
It says East Bengal. What are those things got to do with East Bengal, apart from Pakistan? And shouldn't it be Jinnah if it's about Pakistan? So on and so forth. So it doesn't ring histories that you're told that you're celebrating the day.
But what is also the governor of East Bengal? Why is the governor of East Bengal Sir Frederick Chalmers Bourne? And why is he swearing?
It's not sense of independence going on. Always that's gone very much for the king and the governor.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Well, it's not a republic yet. It's still part of the empire, essentially, the Commonwealth.
Mm.
Which are things we've forgotten. I think people at the time wouldn't have been surprised by it.
Precisely.
They would have expected this.
Mm-hmm.
Later...
But would the people there have expected this? Because if you see other clips of East Pakistan, I mean, if you see Ahmed Kamal's description or Tapan Chaudhry's, I think, description of how celebrations, independence celebrations were made, I mean, they're drastically different. I mean, there's firecrackers going off, there's prisoners demanding to be released, there's a disjuncture that's happening here in how a post-colonial state of Pakistan is being imagined. Are there, any other questions around No. Okay, I mean, it's really just to give you a sense of sort of what independence looked like at different levels, right? It's sort of looking at it from a state level where you have, someone swearing. It's the same thing. There's a continuity that's happening there at the state level. There's a sort of, you have a governor from, I think he's Welsh, but anyway, you have a British governor sort of ruling, essentially sort of in charge of a province of Pakistan which holds the majority of the population of Pakistan. And the majority, there's a difference in terms of, and there's a difference in terms of, how people are imagining it at the ground level, how are peasants celebrating it? How are workers celebrating independence? Is their imagination? Do they imagine independence to be like this? So there's different things to be playing around. What are the political imaginations or the social imaginations around East Pakistan? What do we know about that? How much have we researched into that so far? We've sort of looked into the horrors of partition, or we've thought about the migration from East Bengal to West Bengal, West Bengal to East Bengal. But what's our understanding of what people actually made of Pakistan? Sorry.
For example, it's a bigger story, and there is no one story. There are
there's stories. No one story. Yes.
There's no one story. And in conventional history, what is happening is you have the official version. You have, as you said, the nation is homogeneous, so divided into two communities. But I'll give you 2 or 3 examples, for example, about the awkwardness of 47. For example, there was a peasant rebellion happening. There was happening at the same time as there was criminal riot in Calcutta. Yeah? But peasants at that level were not rioting in East Bengal. They were fighting against the feudal lords in East Bengal. Then there was rebellion of the Indian National Navy.
Yeah.
And the British were very, very worried, that there were strikes around that. And then you also had, where Bhashani comes in the sense that Bhashani's greatest achievement perhaps is, and this has not been brought up as yet, you also have the first person who has worked on it at a serious level, his ability to mobilize peasants. Because we talked about 71, we talked about 52, but there were 3 peasant conferences that took place where peasants came from hundreds of miles, and those conferences were in Shantosh, in Meherpur, and in Pakshi. And I've been to 1 or 2 of them when I was very kid, I was a young person. And you can't believe that if it was look like a fairy tale if I say that, how many people turned up. It was seemed like a fairy tale because that's the story.
But we know so little because we're not approaching people like you, right?
You mentioned, and this is very interesting, you mentioned Ahmed Kamal, because he's perhaps the only historian who is not a conventional historian.
No.
He will not, if you see him, you will not think he's a historian, who has been taught by the subalterns. He's the only Bangladeshi historian who worked under subaltern historians, who themselves are an awkward tendency because they ask the question that you asked at the beginning, which is who speaks for the nation? It's not, politics didn't start with Muslim League being formed or Congress being formed. Politics, when British started ruling from 1757, started when the state at the local level was being opposed by the peasants. But that story has not yet been unearthed, even though there are some fascinating works that are happened. And what it throws up is the issue of how they are mobilized, because we all know how urban middle class is mobilized. They are mobilized through political parties, through meetings, through organizations. And that is why it will be interesting to examine Maulana Bhashani's language. For example, as you said, you put Jalao, Pora, Gherao. These are not ordinary conventional middle class language. And people will say, oh, they are the anarchic peasants. Maulana is a rebel rouser, a red Maulana, whatever, you know. And it's very difficult to pigeonhole him.
Yeah.
You can't pigeonhole him. He's a peer. Yeah. He's a revolutionary. He speaks, as you said, middle class. He not only came, he came in '54 to Vienna in the peace conference. So he's not somebody who's not familiar with modernity. He is, but he wears a lungi. Yeah? So he's not modern. But then he's modern. Yeah? So it's very difficult to be in the book again. And opening up Maulana Bhashani, I think will open up a lot of the hidden histories that have not been analyzed because you can't fit it within conventional history. The subalterns have done a lot of work. But one of the reasons they have not worked, I think, on peasantry in East Bengal or on the culture of middle class Bangladeshis is because most of them they were from East Bengal, but they came from the Hindu community. And they didn't want to study that deliberately, I think, because they thought they were not appropriate to study that. Yeah, but that's my feeling, because I could understand why they will leave that side out. Even though they did it with peasants, there is a work by Gautam Bhadra, Isham, which is a fascinating work of peasant insurgency in Bengali. But they have not touched for some reason the cultural middle class, the Bhasha and all that. Yeah? They have not touched it. And I think one of the reasons might be that we are not perhaps the appropriate interlocutor for that. Yeah? Might be, I don't know them. I don't know.
Who decides who's the proper interlocutor?
I'm just an amateur person. But it is very fascinating that you have done this. Hopefully, by doing this, I mean, I'm sure it took 7 years because there's hardly anything on Maulana Bhashani. It's a bit like writing the present history in the way Ronald you have done, by reading official archives and deconstructing the language. And he did that for 20 years, reading all the archives. And through that language, trying to find out from the colonial sort of perspective how it has changed. And by that change, trying to deconstruct something.
But it's also finding other archives, right? It's also finding other archives. There's sort of sticking with the official archives.
What happens is that over a period of time, the language changes, and if you read the language in a way Ravijit Go did, it will also perhaps begin to construct the history of the other, which is the present. The present haven't left any written history. They have songs, ballads, pictures, and stories, but beyond that they haven't left. But even by reading the official, I haven't read, I'm not a historian, but I have a feeling that the changes that have occurred over a period of 30-40 years of governors and submission officers writing to the superiors shows, the problems that they face in trying to control the revolution.
I'm just going to quickly go through the other if you could, yes, you could just change it. So these are two sources. One is a court case and it's being judged by the Commissioner of Chittagong on the Karnataka riots in '54, and the other one is a serious rioting in Adamji jute mills. I mean, do we know anything about the Adamji jute mills or the Karnataka paper mills or anything about '54 itself? 1954. What's happening in Bengal? No? Yes, elections are happening in Bengal, where the Jukta Front, which is a coalition of Fazlul Haq, Sohrawardi, and Bhashani, overwhelmingly defeat the sort of incumbent provincial government, and that's sort of the Muslim League. But at the same time, what you have are two riots. So far, the histories have focused on that sort of overwhelming defeat of the Muslim League, as well as the sort of after the defeat, the Muslim League come in and they impose provincial governor's rule. The victory of the Jukta Front is overturned and governor's rule is sort of enforced. And Iskandar Mirza comes in. Now, there's a reason why so far histories have looked at this sort of overturning of this victory as a result of, there's fiasco at the center, there's politicians fighting out, there's problems at the top. The Jukta Front can't decide who the leader is going to be. There's Fazlul Haq making apparently seditious statements in Kolkata. But there's also 2 riots that are happening at that point. These are the 2 worst labor riots in the history of the subcontinent. Nobody talks about the Adamji or the Karnafuli riots, although they are the most destructive riots. In Adamji, over 600 people die in the space of 2 or 3 hours. And these are Bihari and Bengali workers. And it's the same in Karnafuli, which is the sort of a paper mill in Chittagong, where the entire management, Bihari management, is wiped out. Now, it's seen as a communal incident. But it's seen as a communal incident. It's a Bihari and Bengali thing. This is all to do with the provincial sort of a parochial nationalism of the parochialism of the East Bengalis. But there's actually, the thing is, you have now overlooked one of the most destructive riots by submerging it into the incident or subsuming it as part of this electoral event. And I'm assuming no one has heard of these riots. You've heard of these riots, but I feel but no one else has heard of this. And there's a reason why no one else has heard of this. And we need to uncover, I don't want to really give away, but we need to talk about why these riots have been subsumed, why have they been submerged, why in one of the sort of events where we actually have worker agency, why are we not talking about it? Why did workers riot against management? Who were these workers? What were they? We have reports saying, when the Pakistani PM, I can't remember, I think it's Chaudhry Muhammad Ali at that point, who turns around and says, this is an act of war against Pakistan. They've taken, and this is an act of war. But at the same time, when you look at these court case reports, you have people, you have the workers saying, Khurshid Ali Murdabad, Pakistan Zindabad. How is this an act of war against Pakistan when you have workers saying Pakistan Zindabad? But they're saying something else. They're saying Khurshid Ali Murdabad. Who is Khurshid Ali? What is his role here? What is the role of the workers? What is the role of management? And what is the role of industrialization, or our understanding of industrialization in East Pakistan? And, what's happening here? So, this is another incident that has been overlooked. Although this is the incident that brings in governor's rule, not the 1952 language riot, sort of the Bhasha Andolan. The Bhasha Andolan brings in an inquiry report, but this brings in a clampdown on workers and the first sort of setup of an industrial police force in Bengal. Anyone heard of the 1957 Kagmari conference? I know that you've heard of it. I'm going to discount. No one's heard of the 1957 Kagmari conference. So Awami League splits at that point. Well, kind of around that point, a few months later. But it splits on the basis of something that's happening in Kagmari, which is the Awami League Council Convention debates. There's a split that happens on the question of foreign policy. And, it's a split between Bhashani and Sohrawardi. It's a split between Bhashani, Sohrawardi, and Mujib on this side. Now, why does this split, or why does this debate take the form of a festival? And why does it take the form of a festival? Why does this council convention happen in a festival in Tangail? That's an interesting question. what is happening here? Who is Bhashani trying to mobilize here? So there's an idea that, Bhashani is this rustic leader, doesn't understand modernity, doesn't really understand politics as such. But it's Bhashani who sides on the case of an independent, neutral foreign policy. He's calling for non-alignment. And it's Suhrawardi and Mujib who bring in the case for, who bring in the case for a military pact or for a bilateral pact. And they make that case in front of students in Dhaka University. Suhrawardi fails to make his case here. You hear peasants shouting at the end of this conference, Vishwa Shakti Zindabad. So world peace, Zindabad. So you have peasants shouting for world peace. Now, how does this come about? How are workers thinking about how are workers and peasants thinking about internationalism? How does Bhashani make his case for world peace, for non-alignment, for internationalism in front of peasants and workers? That's not your natural constituency. Suhrawardi certainly doesn't think of it as his natural constituency. He thinks that that case, the peasants are worried about bread and butter. But the students and the intelligence there, they know more. We should make the case for the bilateral pacts there. But Bhashani successfully makes a case for non-alignment in that conference. And we've got to ask why it took the form of a festival, where you have songs and dances and latikilla and, all of these other things. And gates, he had 50 gates lined up in Tangai, 50 or more gates, where it had the names of various leaders from all over the world. You've got Wordsworth next to Lincoln. You've got the Prophet next to Jinnah. And it's not the Prophet who gets... There's no ornamental hierarchy in the ordering of these gates. There's no hierarchy. It's actually Jinnah rather than the Prophet who gets the largest gate. And you've got to ask what's happening there. So this is 57. The next picture, which is an equally interesting picture, is Bhashani had at that point, when people talk about Bhashani, they talk about his salam to Pakistan. Bhashani makes this salam to Pakistan, and this is the sound or the beginnings of, of Bangladesh's sort of move towards, provincial autonomy or secession. But what you have here is him sitting with Bacha Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan of the Northwest provinces. You have Qazi Faiz Muhammad, who's of Balochistan. He's of Sindh. And you have Abdul Razak Sumro. What you have sitting there is actually an all-Pakistan leader. You have a guy who's not actually saying goodbye to Pakistan. He's thinking about Pakistan in a different way. Or what is post sort of 1947, if we think of a leader who's able to hold currency, other than Jinnah, who's able to hold currency in both wings, who would that be? Who's the old Pakistan figure that you think about when we're other than Jinnah? There's no old Pakistan figures? Bhashani. No, it is Bhashani. Because he holds weight in both wings. He holds it in West and the East Pakistan. But he holds it, it's a different Pakistan that he's envisaging. Right? Let's have that mulling in your heads for a while. And then we'll go to the last one. We can skip this. Okay, so this is a video taken 2 weeks before the war. It's a footage from, it's taken 2 weeks before the war itself. It's happening in Polton Moidan. And I'm hoping that we've got sound, because the sound is really important here. Just do tell me, I want you to actually tell me what you see. And I'll tell you what I saw. Can we put the sound? Yeah. Okay. Can we... Okay. It's very important that you see this video. It's a short clip. It's a 2-3 minute clip, but there's a lot happening here, and I'll tell you what's happening here. Myself, but is there any way to enlarge that? Like, the colours are not great, but there's meant to be a lot of red happening there. Right, okay. Any thoughts on that? Whatever you could... Anything. Any stupid, simple, or whatever thoughts. Any questions around the video? There's things happening, right? Who are the red caps there? Why are they wearing red caps? Right? What's Shamrajya? I mean, what is Shamrajyabad? Why is Bhashani being called the Jatir Pita, the father of the nation? There's a... I mean, who is the father of the nation? Go on.
It's the beginning of a nationalization.
But the Jatir Pita is Mujib. And I'm going to show you something, which I only know because I'm going to ask you to observe this very closely. It's going to be very difficult to spot. Okay, so here, and it's not, you can't see it. I could only see it because I watched that video thousands of, like, enough times. It says demand in North Bengal province. So what is it? Demand in North Bengal province. Not demand Bangladesh, demand in North Bengal province. There's red caps there, there's Bhashani there. There's Bhashani being called Jatir Pita. Why is there a demand for a North Bengal province? Who's demanding this North Bengal province? What story is not being told to us? It appears that there's a smaller secessionist movement within a larger movement for provincial autonomy. And what is North Bengal? Is it the North Bengal of now, or is it wider North Bengal? And I think that's, we've got to think about the fact that there were different imaginations, or political imaginations, or political understanding around 71 itself. Around the role of Mujib. It's not Mujib that's being called sort of Jatir Pita here. It's Bhashani. Why is I mean, and so that is, I mean, these are things that I want you to think about. The sources that we use, this is an audio, I mean, this is a visual footage. So far, the reliance has been, when it comes to thinking about 47 to 71, has been on the written text. The written text dominates for historians. You know, we're going back to the official archives. But if we're thinking about deconstructing, let's deconstruct other things beyond text. Let's deconstruct videos, let's deconstruct audios, poetry, songs that were being sung, and things like even the aesthetics. You know, who are these red caps? I mean, these aren't just any red cap. There's like, you know, they're like skull caps turned into red. And they're at the meeting of a peer and a meeting of a Maulana. What is a Maulana doing, having an attendance in a rally of people with wearing red caps? So these are, I mean, I'm not going to answer those questions for you because that's partly my book and partly the work that I've been doing and hoping to turn into a book. But I'm just saying that the story of East Pakistan or the story of Bangladesh as we know it has yet to be written. There's other possibilities, there's other tensions, there's phorias that just has not been explored yet. And we do that through looking at looking at everything. I spent the last, and I'm not sure if the 2021 or the 2021 history and project will have access to all the materials that I've had access to. I've had to fight for, and I've had to fight for material. But you know, I think it's important that the history of, you know, that we are thinking about histories and how we go about writing. If we leave it to the realm of the professional historian, I mean, I do think there's a danger there. I think there's a danger there in, you know, because, you know, the knowledge production is another form of social control, and we need to democratize this process. So I'm sorry that this was me rambling on at you and stuff, and I apologize for the lack of preparedness for this talk, but there will be more talks and better ones later on, so I'll leave it at this now.
We have some time for questions.
And we do have time for questions, yes.
Do you have a book coming out?
Yes, there will be a book coming out in 2018.
Well, I don't have a question either. There's a lot to discuss. But
Can I
congratulate you for doing the work that you've done?
Thank you.
And the time you've taken and the way you're trying to explore that is fascinating. I congratulate you for that. But there's a lot to discuss, but I don't want to discuss today because...
Sure, I mean, I'd love to chat with you as well.
Immediately discuss, because I don't think it will do justice to the type of work that it will be by, you know, making odd comments here and there. But
Odd comments should not be dismissed, though. Odd comments are good.
I'm not dismissing odd comments. What I'm saying is that I don't want to structure things also.
Yeah. Sure. Okay. I think there was a question that you... That's okay.
When you say there are other possibilities, so what are you thinking towards other than
What am I...
other than that, the national fight for civil rights? So what are the possibilities?
I mean, I'm suggesting that there are other registers for understanding why 71 happened. There are other political imaginations, and I'm not dismissing or diminishing the claims that were being made at that point, but I'm saying that there were other claims that were being made, and that concerns equality, that concerns sort of justice, issues of democratization, issues around socialism, and more. And I mean, there's a richer imagination than the one that's been culled so far in the histories of 71, and which has really just been contained in the 6 points, right? So far, what we've heard is really the 6 points, and then the 69 movements. And mine is to look at what that sort of, you know, to deconstruct those 6 points and see how did that translate in different sort of constituencies? How did those 6 points mean something? If they did, what do they mean? There's different meanings, And there's different rationalities that I'm trying to get at with my work. And I mean, so I'm not sure if I've answered your questions, but is that okay? Yeah, cool.
You talk about how official histories or dominant histories play down Bhashani or ignore him or actually completely insult him and classes from or they look down on him. I haven't read much of this material, but the one example that comes to mind of that would be from Tariq Ali in his writing. His teachings on Bhashani. He's from Pakistan, England. Supposedly he's interested in workers, peasants, and he's had meetings at the time. And it's a very dismissive caricature he writes of this.
Of Bhashani,
in his autobiography. So that still rings true. But
I mean, the left in itself, who admit to his magnetic personality. I mean, so you go with Tariq Ali, and he refers to spending 3 weeks in sort of Bengal, or 6 weeks, where he's with Bhashani and studying the topography of Bengal and seeing whether it's ready for guerrilla war as such. I mean, this is what Tariq Ali claims that he's doing in his 6 street fighting years. But then he goes on to dismiss Bhashani. He goes on to call Bhashani, he talks about, the Bhashani really doesn't know much. It's people feeding ideas to him. And it's a dismissal that's quite easily made by the left. The left need him, but they also don't want to accept. But the left also have difficulties in accepting the fact that they need him.
He's from an aristocratic background.
Oh yeah, there's definitely a class thing that's happening there. There's definitely also, the fact that, Tariq is having to take his lessons from a Maulana. That's particularly unappetizing to Tariq there. It's not just a class thing, it's also...
That's the only sort of prism in which I sort of viewed. Because of the material.
And it's...
The way it's just ignored by everyone.
Which is quite, and I'll tell you why, for me, Bhashani has a lot of resonance in different sort of areas. So, Amitav Ghosh writes his recent book on climate change, right? This is he calls it the Great Derangement. And so he does this whole thing that we need religious leaders to organize and mobilize because they have large followings on this issue of the environment and climate change. Now, what Amitav is suggesting is not really new or radical because it's been done before. In 1976, we have the Faraka March. We have, which has the long march to the Faraka dams, where Bhashani is making an argument for the sort of the drying up or the the diverting of the river Ganges, the protection of the deltaic livelihoods. And so, and he mobilizes almost, I think there's a figure that's been floating around in sort of the US archives from 40,000 to 1 million. That's a pretty large environmental march. And not only, there's something really fascinating happening in what Bhashani does in that march as well. He's calling in the revolutionary undertones, right? There's the undertones of the Long March of the Red Army of China. But he also does this whole oath-swearing ceremony before he goes out with the protesters. And he invokes the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, which is and that's in itself, what is Bhashani do? How is he, this is the sort of, the treaty that was made by the Prophet as he sort of enters into, with his followers, into...
Just before he enters
Makkah, yep, precisely. So it's, what is Bhashani doing invoking these different undertones? What is he bringing? What worlds is he bringing together? And how is he bringing those two different worlds? And Bhashani is also talking about nuclear energy or nuclear war to the peasants in that Kagmari conference. The peasants really don't know about nuclear war, right? They don't understand. But he still brings it to them, and he uses it to explain it in terms of crop failure. if we have nuclear weapons, what that means is crop failure. I mean, which possibly isn't the case, right? I mean, it's a lot more complex than that. But what he's trying to do is make it real to these peasants. Because these peasants only understand crop failure the most. They've been suffering. I mean, and so what he does is he invokes the 43 famine, and then he invokes the nuclear weapons. He brings in something that's very intimate to the lives of these peasants, which was the 43 famine. And he equates that, he makes that equivalent to something, or the nuclear war, as worse than that. So Bhashani is, bringing in really interesting issues around climate, around weapons, and around, he's not just talking about nationalism, or, he's a leader, he's a regional leader, he's a global leader. There's a lot more to be explored. Mm-hmm.
I agree with you. His juxtapositions is fascinating. I just have one question. The only other leader I can think of who could mobilize the president the way Bhashani did was Fazlul Haq, on whom also there are very few works. But do you see any parallels between them? Because I remember reading Sheikh Mujib's biography that his father tells him, you can do Muslim thing, that's not a problem. As long as you're not against Haq, you must not say anything there. So, Fazlul Haq had the same sort of magnetic sort of...
Yes, very much so.
Do you see any parallels between...
Yes, completely. I see you have to also, they were contemporaries in a sense, right? They were in the Jokto front together. They were, there's parallels in how Fazlul Haq mobilizes peasantry. In the way that Fazlul Haq is unable to do that, though, with the urban workers. And Bhashani is able to do that. There's parallels to be made with Fazlul Haq, but there's also differences to be to excavate between those two leaders. And it's one of those things that I think that there's a lot to be said yet about East Bengal. There's a lot yet to be said about the leaders of East Bengal. There's a lot to be said about Fazlul Haq. Who moves the 1940 Lahore resolution? Who is it? It's not Jinnah, it's Fazlul Haq that moves the Lahore resolution. What is Fazlul Haq, an East Bengali, doing, moving or calling for, independent and sovereign states? And so I think there's a lot to be, and where is the majority of the support coming from Pakistan? Where is the referendum for Pakistan being held? The only referendum for Pakistan being held. That's in Sylhet. Right? That's the only referendum that's being there. There was meant to be a referendum in the northwest provinces, right? That doesn't get held. Yeah, that doesn't get. Was it?
No.
There was a referendum, but I thought it didn't get held.
Yeah, there was a referendum, and a popular referendum.
Mm-hmm. There was a referendum.
They actually choose
to stay with India, right? Yeah. So
not India, it's Pakistan.
In the northwest provinces.
And I think Khan Abdul Qayyum Khan was, by the side of a Muslim League.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's okay.
The provincial government was not in favor.
The provincial government was not in favor
because it was coalition government with Congress.
Okay.
Yeah, Red Shirts government and Congress government, coalition government.
Sure. Okay. Okay. I learned something. The Muslim League was formed in Dhaka. The National Awami Party was formed in Roop Mahal Cinema Hall, right?
What I'm saying, the Muslim League was not formed in Rawalpindi.
No. But even like the National Awami Party, which is now found in various variations in Pakistan, right?
Law resolution. It was, given by Fazlul Haq, a Bengali leader, and when in 1946 it was renamed as Pakistan Resolution, it was suggested by Sohawadi, another Bengali leader.
Yes. Yeah. So there's interesting things happening there with who's where is the majority of support coming from? Why is the majority of support coming from there? Why does Jinnah start including Assam in his sort of the cartography Pakistan in 1946, because Assam gets included into that map. And who is in Assam before 1947? We need to think about what's happening, and that's where Bhashani is. But yeah. Are there any other questions? No. Yes. Okay.